Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, the second of 4 webinars in the Export Control series, Overcoming Barriers to Trade. Today we have Trevor Wood from Inter-Export Management Systems, and today's webinar topic will be, are my goods on a control list? Now, okay, Trevor?
Thank you, Ian. Yes, thank you very much. So today we're going to be looking at the control list itself, and I'm going to be trying to give you some tips and pointers on how you can try and search for your goods and whether they are actually on the control list or not. On the presentation, I'm going to be using a couple of different websites. Now, we're not going to go to them live because that may give us problems with the webinar, but if you want to log on to them from where you are, we're going to be using the Strategic Export Control Lists. You can download them from the ECO website. If you go to your browser and type in Strategic Export Control Lists, it should come up as the first link, and you can then open that document. The second tool I'll be using is the Goods Checker, and again, the same thing applies. If you go to a browser, type in the words Goods Checker, I think it will come up normally as the first link that you can use, and you can click on that and then follow what we're doing on the presentation. In terms of doing this presentation today, it is on behalf of the Export Control Organisation. My role there is that I present a seminar called the Control List Classification Workshop for the Export Control Organisation, and some of the slides and some of the material that we'll be using today comes from that workshop. So if you move to the next slide, and this is where we really start with the effort of trying to decide if your goods are controlled. This is the Strategic Export Control List document that you can download from the Export Control Organisation website. You can see from the slide that the version we have there is dated December 2015. So that was the last time this list was updated. It's generally updated twice a year. We would expect an update quite soon, which will cover the military list. And then at December, we get an update normally to the European Union dual-use list, which I'll be mentioning in a moment. The basic model is, if your goods are listed anywhere in these 294 pages, then you will require an export license if they're going to leave the UK. If they're going to a European Union destination for dual-use goods, you will still need to put on the paperwork that they would be controlled if exported outside of the European Union. So in effect, you do need to classify all of your goods that are going out of the UK against these lists. The list contains several sub-lists, if you like. The first one is the military list, and that covers any military goods. We also have lists covering human rights or torture goods, goods that could be used for those. We have a list of radioactive sources. And then we have what are called dual-use goods, and these are both UK coverage of dual-use goods and the European Union dual-use goods, which cover the majority of the lists. Sorry, the majority of the pages on these lists. So let's move to the next slide, which describes the first decision that you're going to have to make if you're trying to classify your goods. And the first place that you need to think about is, are your goods military goods or are they dual-use goods? Now, if we start with military goods, they're a bit easier to understand. So a military item is something that was originally designed for military use. And we've got a picture there of a battle tank. I'm sure that was designed for military use. I don't think there was any other design criteria involved there. So that's clearly a military item, and that will be considered on the military list. Also, any item if it's modified for military use. So if the military see a commercial item, perhaps a radar, and decide, well, we could use that, but we would need a few changes, and they specify some changes to that equipment, then that will be modified for military use, and again, would be considered against the military list. So if you think about any of your products, they've either been designed for military use or modified for military use, you need to look at the military list itself. Perhaps the main factor about the military list is if you do have something that fits into that category, it's almost certainly going to be controlled, and you will need an export license for it. there are many items that are designed for military use that aren't on the control list. Basic uniforms, ration packs, but that's about all. So if you have something military, it's going to be on the list somewhere. Now, a dual-use item is something that's designed for a commercial use, but then can be used by either a commercial user or by a military user in an unchanged form. And so it's the design, when you're thinking about a commercial application, that's what you're aiming your product at, but it could be bought by either of those types of users. Again, it wouldn't be modified in any way for a military application. Dual-use items are controlled because they could be used by military end users, or they could be used in weapons of mass destruction, and that could be nuclear, chemical, biological. And the dual-use list covers the items that are the most sensitive that could be used in those applications. Typically, only about 1% of dual-use items are controlled. The majority are not controlled. And so that's a significant difference to the military list, where the majority are controlled. If we move to the next slide, just got a few examples of the types of things you might have to think about and to make this decision. Now, we've looked at the main battle tank already. Pretty clearly, that is designed for military use, will be on the military list. But what if we took that same item, it's finished its useful life with the military, been decommissioned, and it's at some adventure park being used to take people around the site? Well, if you're exporting that, that's still seen as a military item. The original design was military. You would still need a military item if you wanted to export that item. It hasn't changed its design. The other side of the coin, if we're looking at a dual-use item, well, the mass market mobile phone that you've probably all got sitting in your pockets, that's a classic example of a dual-use item. It's been designed for anyone to use, so it's commercial users, but equally someone in the military could buy that phone and use it. It doesn't change its designation from being a dual-use item. It's still considered against the dual-use list. And in fact, most mobile phones would not be controlled. They're not on that list. However, if the military went to a mobile phone manufacturer and said, well, we really like your phone, but we want you to change perhaps the frequency it works at, or change to a ruggedized case, that's when it's modified for military use, and that's when you'd have to think about the military. So that's the first decision you make. If we move on to the next slide, though, let's think about dual-use items now. And I talked about the tools that are available for you to use. So let's start with the PDF document. So what I'm showing here is that I've done a search by doing Control F and typing in the word computer. It comes up with lots of matches to computers. It's mentioned lots of times in the lists. I'm showing on the screen here matches in category 4. Category 4 is the dual-use category that covers computers, and that you would find them if you put the search word in and look down the list. You could equally use the advanced search that exists on PDF under Edit, and then you would find all occurrences and you could sift between. But it helps you to find keywords that are on the list. If we go to the next slide, we can see the goods checker. Now, this is using exactly the same control list. There's no difference. It just presents the results in a different way. And again, there are lots of matches to computers, so I've scrolled down to find category 4 again. So you can see that the goods checker shows you every occurrence of that word and pulls out the top level of that entry where that word exists. And here we can see we've got one in 4A001, 4A003, etc. And we could then click into those entries for more information about exactly what that control meant. So let's move on to the next slide. I just want to say a few words about the dual-use list itself. The way the list is put together, it consists of 10 categories, and you can see them on the screen now. So your goods have to fit into one of those 10 categories to be controlled. So we can immediately see that if you were exporting furniture, it's not there. There's no entry for it. If you're exporting vehicles, you're going to find it difficult. There's not really an entry that relates to that. What is on there, just going quickly through these categories, 0 is very special nuclear materials. 1 are generally high-strength materials, such as carbon fiber, high-strength steels, etc. 2 covers materials processing. This is normally machines that you make things from, so turning machines, milling machines. 3 is electronics, that covers integrated circuits, microwave devices. 4, computers, so these generally these days are very high-level computers, high-performance computers. 5 is split into 2. 5 part 1 is telecoms, so that's advanced telecom switching systems, perhaps optical fibers. 5 part 2, thank you. 5 part 2 is called information security or encryption, and that's quite key at the moment because normally you would only look in one category to find your items. But if your item has encryption in as well, you would always need to look in category 5 part 2 as well. So it's slightly different to the rest of the entries. 6, sensors and lasers, that covers acoustic sensors, cameras, lasers, radar. 7, navigation and avionics, which covers accelerometers, gyros, inertial navigation systems. 8 is called marine, but tends to cover submarines, and that's submersibles and the equipment that goes with submersibles. And then 9, aerospace and propulsion. So that will be covering aero engines, we'll be covering rocket engines, and we'll be covering associated parts that go with them. So you have to be able to fit your items, your commercial dual-use items, into one of those categories. So let's move to the next slide. Let's think about having an unmanned aerial vehicle. Now, they always used to be military, but now we've got quite a lot of dual-use unmanned aerial vehicles. They can be used for inspecting electrical pylons, electrical supply lines, and lots of other applications. So let's think we've got a dual-use UAV, and we want to see if we can find it on the control list. First thing we will do is think about what sort of keyword we might search on. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that I've done a search on the PDF list, and I've searched on UAV. Seemed like a reasonable keyword to use, and it's found it. This isn't the first entry that it would have found. There are other entries on the list that describe parts that go into UAVs, but the control that will cover complete UAVs, if you remember back to the 10 categories that I just went through, is going to be in aerospace and propulsion, category 9. So we're looking for an entry in category 9. And here we found one, 9A012, covers unmanned aerial vehicles, in brackets UAVs, and that's the search word that we found. So if we found the entry that we want, if we had a UAV, we would next need to get the specification sheet and compare it against the parameters that you can see there under 9A012A. Describes what a UAV would need to have to be controlled. And we go through that against the specification sheet, decide whether the item is controlled or not. And then we've got some related equipment further down the screen under B that relates back to UAVs. If we go to the next slide, we can see the same search done on the goods checker. So I've chosen UAV as the search term. You can just see at the bottom of the screen, the first thing it came up with is one on the military list, but we were not interested in that. We've got a dual-use UAV. So if we go to the next slide, again, we can see that we will scroll down and we find under 9A012, there we have our match to a UAV. And there are then some other entries that the goods checker is showing as well under 9A112 that also covers UAVs with a slightly different specification. And we would need to check those entries against our specification to see if our UAV is actually controlled. So that's a relatively straightforward search. The word is there, and we found it on the control list. We go to the next slide. One difference that the goods checker gives you that isn't evident on the PDF is that we can search for more than one key term. Some of the searches that you do results in a lot of results, and sometimes you might want to try and narrow it down by putting more search words in. So on the goods checker, we can click a little button that says Advanced Search, and that will throw up 3 fields where we can put search terms into. What the tool is going to do is to search for those 3 words or 3 terms within the same control entry. They don't need to be together, but they need to be within the same control entry. you'll see two radio buttons a bit further down the screen. The first one says match any, and that's the default setting, so that's selected at the moment. Now, if we did a search with that, it's going to look for every occurrence of each of your key terms. And in fact, if we go to the next slide, you can see where I've started to try and search for unmanned aerial vehicles. So if we had match any selected, it's going to find every occurrence of unmanned, every occurrence of aerial, every occurrence of vehicle, which may be okay. But the real power in this is when you press the match all, because now it's going to find every occurrence of unmanned, every occurrence of aerial, a vehicle, when they're in the same control. And if we move to the next slide, we'll see the results of that. And there you can see that it's picking up all of these words. We've got actually in 9A012 now, it's picked up unmanned aerial vehicles. You can see next to that, it's also picking up unmanned as well as a separate word. So it's finding where these terms exist, the three terms together in the same entry. Also on the goods checker, as well as the control text, on many of the entries we have something called reasons for control, which tries to give you a background as to why that item is on the list. And in fact, the search will search that text as well, so it can throw up some additional entries that you may not have thought about for your items. Okay, so that's a bit more about the goods checker. Let's go to the next slide, and let's try to make this a bit more practical. Let's try and look for a real item against the list. And what I'm using here is a valve, to see if we can find a valve on the control list. If we go to the next slide, you can see the specification that I've given. So I've made this up. It could well be a specification for a valve, but I'm showing it as having an input diameter of 20 millimeters, got an output diameter of 15 millimeters. It's made from brass, or the outside body material is brass. The wetted material, so this is the actual material that will touch the liquid flowing through the valve. And I'm showing it's got a zirconium coating, and then it's got some seals at each end. So it's got a PTFE, which is a fluoropolymer seal at each end. So that's the valve that we've got. We want to export that. We need to know if that is on the control list. So we're going to go and try our search tools. So let's go to the next slide. And I've used the goods checker. I've typed in just valve as my search word to see what it's going to bring back. Press the search. We'll go to the next slide and have a look at the results of that particular search. Okay. Again, thinking about the categories that exist on the dual use list, the valve is probably going to be used when you're in some sort of process. So materials processing would seem to be the best possible category. And if we look there, you can see that the goods checker has actually picked up two potential entries. We've got 2A226 and we've got 2B350. Now, I've looked in 2A226, we're not going to do it now, but that doesn't actually match the specification of the valve that we've got. But 2B350 is a bit more interesting based on what we're trying to export. So let's go to the next slide and have a look at what that text is. Now, rather than go to the goods checker, I'm using the PDF this time. You could use either. The reason is the PDF actually, I can show all this on one slide, which makes it a bit easier. So it's a bit small, but hopefully you can still read it. So we're looking at entry 2B350, and we're actually down at G at the top of the page. Now, G describes valves and components as follows. And what that means on the control list is you now need to look at what comes next, and that's going to show you the control text. If we look at 1, it says valves having both of the following. And by both of the following, underneath it's got an A and it's got a B. And you can see that A at the end of that line says and. So we've got to meet A and B to be controlled. So let's have a look at A, see how our valve stacks up against that control. So a nominal size greater than 10 millimeters. Well, I'm not sure what nominal size means, but it's got single quotes around it. That means there's a technical note, and if we look further down the list, in fact right to the bottom of this particular page that you've got there, it tells me that the nominal size is defined as the smaller of the inlet or outlet diameters. Okay, if you remember, I had 20 millimeters for my inlet and 15 millimeters for my outlet. So our nominal size is 15 millimeters. Go back to the control at the top, a nominal size greater than 10 millimeters. Well, yes, ours is. So we do meet that. So we need to go to the next control entry. And B then says all surfaces that come in direct contact with the chemicals being produced, processed or contained are made from corrosion-resistant materials. And again, we've got single quotes around that. So we can go down to the technical note. And at 1, we can see, if we drop down to G, 1G, it describes zirconium or zirconium alloys. Well, yes, our valve is lined with zirconium, so that covers it. We've still got the seals to think about, though. They were PTFE, fluoropolymers. And again, if we look at 1C there, under the technical note, fluoropolymers with more than 35% fluorine by weight are controlled as well. So we've met A with the nominal size. We've also met B because all surfaces are either fluoropolymer or zirconium. So we've met that too. So our valve is going to be controlled in that entry, 2B350G1. And if we go to the next slide, that's where I've confirmed that control entry. And that's very typical of how you would assess goods against the list. You get your specification, you try to find where they are on the list, you then compare your specification against what it says on the control list. It either is controlled, i.e. it meets those parameters, or it doesn't. In fact, if our valve hadn't met those parameters, I would have had to carry on to look at 2 to see if it's controlled there, and carry on until I finished looking at 2B350 until I'm certain that the goods are not controlled there. So that's an example of a relatively typical industrial valve. Those types of valves are used in lots of applications where you require something that's corrosion resistant. And that can be in saline plants, it can be in chemical works, it can be in lots of different areas where they have requirements for these. So you will find quite a few of these are actually controlled on the export control list. Let's move on to another tool that you might be able to use. Now, if we move to the next slide, I'm showing something from SPIRE. Now, SPIRE is the Export Control Organization system where you will apply for export licenses, but it also has some other features. I'm afraid only those who have SPIRE access could get on to use this. But if your organization does apply for export licenses, then and you're not eligible, you should be able to get your name added to actually use this if you need to. So what I'm looking at, I put a big arrow at the top of the menu. It should be at the top of your menu on SPIRE. They're all slightly different, but it should be at the top. Is something called the Control List Classification Search tool. Now, this is a tool that the Export Control Organization added a few years ago. What it's done is it takes the information that exporters have put on their export license applications and stores that along with the classification that a technical officer gave to that particular item. So the text is not from the control list, it's from what you, people applying for export licenses, have actually put onto their export licenses. And it can give some advantages and some disadvantages when you're trying to search for goods. Let's just have a look at see how it works. If we move to the next slide, and we'll carry on with the example that I've just been using, we had a valve. So we just enter valve into the search text, press search, and go to the next slide, and we'll see what that gives us back. Now it comes up with 3 columns. It shows a control entry, and these are all valid control entries. They're all on the strategic export control list. In the next column where it says match rating, there's a star system. And the most common, or the number of entries where that rating is the highest, has most stars. It goes up to 5 stars on some, that's the highest. So what we can see here is that people who put valve on their export license applications, the majority of them went for entry 2B350. And that's the entry that we have just been looking at. So that's the most common for people typing in the word valve. Now you will also see that there's a lot of other entries that have valve in them. So that's both the advantage and the disadvantage of this system. It's focused in on the entry that probably is the most likely, but equally it's thrown up lots of other entries where people just happen to have put valve as part of their description. So you need to use this a little carefully, but it will often show you perhaps the best entry to go for. Where it is quite useful is that it will also contain brand names or types that you just won't get from the control list. And if we move to the next slide, I'm looking here, anyone who's involved in encryption may well have heard of an encryption standard called AES, and often that has 128 bits associated with it. That's something that's normally controlled on the control list. If you search for AES 128 on the goods checker, which is what I'm showing has happened here, I've put it in. It says at the bottom there aren't any control entries that match your search. And that's, I perfectly understand that, because the control list isn't written in terms of particular types of, in this case, encryption standard, or indeed in terms of any other brand names. It's written on the specifications of what the goods will do. But if we go to the next slide and we do that search on the control list classification search that's on Spire, we get some different results. What this is showing us is that actually 5A002 is shown as a 4-star match, which shows that the people who have entered AES 128 on their license applications, the majority of them have used 5A002 as a control entry. And indeed, if you have an item that has that type of encryption in, that's exactly the correct entry that you should be going to. And so in this instance, it's been very helpful in showing you the right entry that you should be aiming for. There's another couple of entries which relate to encryption. One is for software, 5D002, and one is for technology, 5E002. And I can imagine that all of those will be correct. That's exactly where you should be going if you had encryption that was controlled. So in that instance, that's quite useful. It's helping you find something that you wouldn't necessarily find on the control lists. So that's just another tool that you can use. If we go to the next slide, I just want to finish by looking at the military list. We haven't focused on this because I'm guessing most of you would have dual-use products. But we'll just run through quickly a military list example. So there are the 22 categories from the military list. The first 20 cover goods, and then ML21 is software relating to those goods. ML22 is relating to technology for those goods. So let's move to an example. On the next slide, I'm suggesting that we might want to be exporting a Tornado aircraft. Okay, it's obviously a military item. We don't need to worry whether it's dual use or not. The way the military list is put together is that it's very much looking at the top level of the item. So in this instance, the best search word is going to be something like aircraft. What the military list controls will cover, though, is almost everything that goes into that aircraft. So as well as the aircraft itself, it will cover any wings for the Tornado. It will cover perhaps guidance systems for the Tornado. It will cover nuts and bolts that might be used putting the aircraft together. But it doesn't list those separately. So you always have to be thinking on the military list of going to the top level, searching for that, and it will then cover specially designed parts. So if we use aircraft as our search word, let's go to the next slide. I think I've used the PDF there. There you go. It's gone immediately to ML10. That is the entry that covers aircraft. If it's a Tornado, you just look down to the first entry. It's a manned aircraft. So that's where that will be controlled. And you'll see if you follow ML10A, it says manned aircraft, light and air vehicles, and specially designed components therefore. So any component designed for that aircraft will be controlled there. So it will cover a whole load of equipment. Just go into the goods checker. Next slide. The same thing. We've done a search on aircraft. It has come up with aircraft that's in a few other entries, but the one that we're looking for is under ML10. That's where the complete aircraft will be controlled, and again, it's highlighted exactly the same entry, ML10, ML10A, which covers any manned aircraft that are military. So in terms of military, just re-emphasize that you need to be thinking about the top level. When you're looking at dual use, they tend to be described more as the item and the component itself. So you would look for the item, like a valve, as we did, or for a pump. You put those words in. For the military list, you go up and look at a higher level. Okay, that's a very almost cursory look at the tools, the things you have available for searching, but those are the basic steps you will go through. Firstly, look to see if your item is military or dual use, so you're looking at the right list. Then start to find the item on the control list, either by using the PDF or by using the goods checker, or perhaps the classification control list that's on the Spire. And then once you've found the item that you're looking for, then you'll need to revert to specifications and compare the item that you have against the item that's on the control list and try to determine whether it's controlled or not. Okay, next slide. That's the end of the presentation. I wanted to run through in about 30 minutes, which I think we've just about done. Now I'm happy to take any questions. Now, before we move on to the questions, I'd also like to introduce Chris Carey, who is sitting with me. Chris is is a technical officer from the technical assessment unit here at the Export Control Organisation. So between Chris and I, we're going to try to field any questions that you may have. And I'll hand back now to Ian to moderate any questions that we have coming in.
Thank you, Trevor, for a really thorough presentation on how to find out if your goods are on the control list. We've had a number of questions through, some submitted before the event and some during the event. So let's start with the first question. And somebody called Abe Marash has asked the question, who has defined country of origin definitively so far, or does it lack an exact definition? I know it's a bit off topic, but...
Yeah, sorry, could you just repeat it? It said, who's defined the country of origin?
Yeah, defined country of origin definitively. Is there a definitive definition or a definitive way to find out?
Yeah, you're right. That's slightly off the topic of deciding whether the item needs a license. Country of origin, as I'm aware, it tends to be used in terms of tariffs, etc. And it depends. There is a definition for how an item builds up, and it depends on where most work is done to it, as to where a country of origin may be. You do need to be a bit careful when you're thinking about export controls, because if an item has been manufactured or has been through the United States, it can attract US export controls, which can be extraterritorial. I mean, if you're exporting something from the UK that has US content, you might need to consider both UK export controls and US export controls. But apart from that, say country of origin generally is a build-up of where work was done on it. I think you'll find more information on that on Chamber of Commerce sites often deal with origin and origin certificates. And that's where you may be able to find more information on that.
Great, thanks very much for that answer. I know it was a bit off topic. Right, we've got Ashok, and he's asked, if the manufacturer or the supplier of goods confirms it's not on an export control list, can we accept that as we are not technical experts? So I think what he's asking is, can you accept a supplier's word for it when they say their goods aren't on the control list when you're re-exporting?
Yeah, very good question. So the answer has to be that the responsibility for the export is with the exporter. So if you're a UK exporter, you're exporting from the UK, it's your responsibility to decide whether your goods are controlled, and if they are, then you need to apply for the export license. How you determine whether your goods are controlled is then up to you and your internal systems how you do that. There are quite a few companies, not enough in my opinion, who will provide the information on how their goods sit against export controls on websites, on files that you can download, which give you very good information. And generally, I think unless you had any qualms about what they were telling you, then I think you may well rely on that if you've got no other information and no other reason to conclude that it's not correct. However, it may be worth just having a look, just in case there's anything else that you think might apply. Or, for instance, if it's a classification from a US company, lots of, for instance, US semiconductor manufacturers provide that type of information, just in case there's any UK national controls that could apply that they wouldn't know about. So it's worth just being up to speed with the list and trying to work it out. But in general, that's part of your evidence, how you came to that conclusion.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's your best endeavour. You recognise that. But as Trevor said, it's any evidence you can provide will help support that.
Right, thanks. It's a very comprehensive answer, I think. Right, so we've got a user called Richard who is asking, would an item fall under the military list if it was a commercial item that was modified for military end use, but the modification was in fit and form only, such as size and not function, e.g. an ex-civilian automotive part modified for military vehicle?
Okay, I mean, this is where it starts to get difficult to determine what the modification is. I suppose the answer will be, and in fact, vehicles in particular, military vehicles come under entry ML6. And there is a technical note there that says a modification is the replacement of an electrical, mechanical, or structural part that is defined as a military item. So if military say we want you to put this component on this vehicle, that's a military item. Putting it on there modifies that vehicle to be a military vehicle. Now the question was more on form and fit. Trying to think of an example of that, but if it's going to be a commercial item that you're putting onto a military vehicle, then that you consider the component itself, whether that was controlled anywhere. If it's not, then that wouldn't require a license. But if you had modified it in any way, then that specifics, I would say you probably would need.
Yes, just to add, the sort of premise is the design intent. So if the design intent is initially for a military vehicle, then it more or less remains a military vehicle, despite modifications. If it's not being designed for that purpose, then we can look at that particular aspect. But it really comes down to what the key original design intent was.
Right, thank you. Right, next question. Lisa has asked, could you please explain how to determine the control list classification codes for human rights and anti-torture goods?
So you broke up a little there. Are you saying what designation you should give?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just flicking to the part of the control list. Okay. Yes. So they come under particular annexes of the export control list. So, for instance, let's pick an example. If you were trying to export gallows and guillotines, is what I'm looking at. So that will be on the export control list. It's under what's called Annex 2, and it's item 1.1 under Annex 2. So I think the abbreviation will be Annex 2 1.1.
Yeah. Sometimes HR, the human rights in front of it.
Will there be HR, 1.1 HR, Annex 2, 1.1. And then I think the others, then we've got Annex 3, which covers other human rights goods. Yeah, so that's, yeah. Okay. So Chris's advice is HR, human rights, and then Annex 2 with the designation, or Annex 3 with the designation.
Great, thank you, guys. Right, next question is from Andrew, and he's asking, if it is still not clear from using the list or the goods checker, is there a service available to him to do it on his behalf, thus endorsing the decision?
Okay, good question. That's a timely question. So about 18 months ago, and prior to that, there was the classification of life service that was run by a technical assessment unit here at the Export Control Organisation. Due to resource complaints, and basically it was because the numbers of license applications were rising, they didn't have sufficient technicals to be able to man that. They had to put all the effort onto licenses, which are a requirement, as opposed to classification requests, which are not. So that service dropped. I suppose the good news is that resource has now been built up. It takes a while to train technical officers, so it has taken a while to build that resource up. And I'm probably going to have to ask Chris for actual date on this, but they are looking to try to reintroduce this service.
Certainly our management have indicated they want to reintroduce the service. We can't give it a specific date at the moment. So I think the only other advice in the interim is there's the helpline, and as Trevor said, do your very best to home in on the areas that you think you can. But in the future, and maybe if we're lucky, sort of towards the latter part of the year, the service might be reintroduced.
And also, right now, if you have an export ready to go and you're not sure, then the best thing to do is to apply for a license. Maybe that you need it anyway. In which case, if you apply for it, you start the process.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, the next question comes from Judith, and she's actually asking, I think it's a comparative question between here and the US. She's asking, does the UK have any rules for allowing foreign nationals who are not UK nationals accessing controlled product inside of the UK? For instance, in the US, for a foreign national to have access to a controlled product, it would require a license even inside the US. So is there any similar legislation here in the UK?
Okay, so what the question relates to is controls from the US cover what are called deemed exports. So it means that if I'm in the US as a UK national and someone in the US discusses with me controlled technology in some way, then effectively they're exporting it to me there because I'm not a US national. And that's how the US legislation works. We don't have the same controls here in the UK other than for weapons of mass destruction applications. I think the UK approach is that if you pass anything to anyone, you're likely to pass either some form of software technology that's either on laptops or somewhere. And if I was in the US and I brought that back, then I would need licenses for that. But actually talking to someone and the deemed export, we don't have that concept in UK legislation.
I think that answers that question very well, thank you. Right, we've got another question in. It's from Ken Smith, and he's asking, if we manufacture parts for a civil aircraft manufacturer, but the aircraft could be converted to an air-to-air refuelling aircraft, would the parts be considered to be dual use?
Right.
I think generally, if it was specifically designed for a civil aircraft, then it remains under the dual use. It's helpful if they can indicate on a particular order if they think that is going to a military end user, because that would imply that it probably was going to be modified for military use. But generally, if you can show the design intent was originally for a civil aircraft, then it remains dual use.
Yeah, so provided there's no modifications made at all to that, and it is standard civil parts, then you get the dual use. See if you can find them license. If not, then no license will be required. The only caveat I would add, I did say just now about checking for any UK national controls, and there are UK national controls on any civil aircraft to Iran. So if you're exporting to that destination, even though civil aircraft are not in the EU during this list, the UK still maintain controls over any civil aircraft and lots of the aircraft parts to Iran as well.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Right, Jorge is asking, how long does it take for the process of obtaining a license, and what are the costs, if any? And is it a one-off license or per shipment?
Okay, that's probably actually a good intro to the next webinar that's going to be, I think, in a few days' time on licensing. But just to answer that question, first question I think was how long does it take? There is a target of processing 70% of licenses in 20 working days. And if you look on the Export Control Organisation website, there's a dashboard that shows how they're getting on against that. I must admit, I haven't looked at it recently. I know that it was well above 70% last time I looked. And then there is another target, I think, of doing 99% in 60 working days as well. And again, last time I looked, I think it was preciously close to that. So that's generally, obviously, every license is different. So if 70% take 20 working days, some will take longer. And it just depends on the goods and the destination and the end user as to exactly how long it will take. The next part was cost. At the moment, there is no cost to export licenses. It's something that's been discussed in the past as to whether there should be. Who knows? But right now, there is no cost to an export license. And in terms of other licenses, yes, there are. The standard license basically allows you to export certain type of good or quantity of goods to a certain end user, and that's a standard export license. If you're going to be using more of those, then what you can apply for is something called an open individual export license, or OIL, and that will allow you to export multiple shipments to a range of end users. And then there are also what are called open general export licenses, which are probably the most useful. They are published publicly. Anyone can use them, provided they register and meet the conditions. And that generally allows the export of the least sensitive goods to the least sensitive destinations. And if you can use one of those, it's in your interest, it's in the interest of the Export Control Organisation. You don't need to apply for the license, and you have it almost straight away. Yes, Kevin?
Typically 2 years for your seal.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Typically, a standard license will last 2 years. An open license, open individual license, can be anything from 3 to 5 years, depending on the end destination of the goods. But say, there is another webinar, I think it's the one in 2 days' time, we'll be addressing issues of
Okay, thanks very much, Trevor. Right, I think we've got time for one more question, and we've got Daniel who is asking, how do we provide evidence that we've done due diligence checks and found no controls in place for audit purposes?
So I think I got the question. The question was, how do you show due diligence in your classification search? Is that right?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Okay, but there isn't. I mean, there isn't really an audit that someone will come around necessarily and see on every export as to whether you've done the right thing or not. There will be audits for anyone who holds an open license, either an individual license or a general license, and for some form of seals as well. Now, as part of those licenses, you need to record certain information that is specified in those licenses and in the legislation. And what you will be expected to show is that you have got the classification for the items that you're exporting. And so what you really need to be able to show is the process you went through, and almost the process that we went through today, working out are your goods military on their dual use, going through the dual use list, finding the appropriate entry, and then being able to demonstrate whether your goods are controlled there or whether they're not, is really key to doing that. And then to retaining any of that information so that an auditor can see that if they come in.
I think it's worth saying the very least is to keep a record, a list of what goods have been shipped under that particular license.
Yeah, you'll need to keep a list of the goods, you'll need to keep a list of the dates, where they went to, which countries, to show that you're complying with the terms and conditions of those licenses. And the classification of goods is just one element that you'll need to be able to demonstrate that you can comply.